Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gosztonyi, and I have with me Catherine Korah. We are coordinators of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management, and very pleased to be here today together with our colleagues from the Center of Excellence for Physically, Intellectually, and Mentally Challenged Students. This is a second part of a three-part series. The first part was on understanding emotions, and today it's about understanding counterwill, resistance, and opposition. And at the end of the month, and we'll post the date and time, we will be having a question and answer where people can bounce ideas off of us and ask questions about how to apply the ideas that we shared. And we will be joined at that time with our colleagues with Claudia and Sarah from the Center of Excellence PIM. So my name is Gosztonyi, and I am very pleased that Catherine is here today to share the topic of opposition and counterwill. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you so much. So I will share screen. Here we go. And so today's presentation, of course, as we mentioned, is geared towards students with multiple challenges. We know that from the participants that are here today, there's probably a combination of teachers, support staff. Honestly, this material can apply to any adult that works with a child, not just school staff, families as well, parents too. And really, this instinct is not specific to a child with multiple challenges. It's it's a reality that we all contend with as adults working with children in school and parents having our children at home. So with no further ado, the face of this little girl says it all, the eyes, how the pushback, the resistance when they feel the pressure from the adult who is requesting a task or that has a directive to give. And we often see this it's more obvious with our 2-year-olds when they're in their no phase. They'll say no to anything and everything, even a cookie, they'll say no to. And so, of course, being in a classroom where there are tasks to be done and assignments to be completed, counterwill, which is the term that the Gordon Neufeld, and actually he didn't coin the term, it came from Otto Rank, a theorist from many, many years ago. And so this idea that the resistance and opposition in us is not something that we choose to do, it's an instinct that pushes us to react, a pushback to the will of others. And so it is a defensive reaction to a perceived control and coercion coming from somebody else. And so, of course, if you're support staff, if you're an attendant working in a classroom with a student and you're trying to help them get through a task, I'm assuming regularly you must be getting some pushback from this child. And so, please understand that this is an instinct. Students do not choose to do this. This happens to them. Now, the counterwill instinct to kind of, stretch it out a little bit and look at it, more deeply, it could look like the opposite, that the student will do the opposite of what is expected, that they may resist what it is that we're asking or counter what it is that we're giving as a directive. They may come across as obstinate or stubborn. They may be very argumentative or quarrelsome, to be non-compliant and defiant. This is where we coin the diagnosis oppositional defiance disorder, coming from this idea. But of course, from a developmental perspective, we don't speak of disorder, we speak about instinct and how the behavior comes from that, to disobey and defy, etc., etc. And so I would invite you to start thinking about students that you work with, and to try to think about what are examples of signs that you may have seen of the students showing opposition and resistance. And of course, this can come out in so many different shapes and forms. Yes, I talked about the no from the 2-year-old, and so the verbal no can be the opposition or the resistance. But there's many forms, whether it's through the nonverbal, the paraverbal, the physical, where there's really like a pushback or other. And so, of course, we're not going to answer to these questions today. These are kind of just these leading reflective questions for you to think about as I'm speaking about, this topic, and maybe perhaps, as you go back to the material later, to start thinking about, oh my goodness, now that I think about Susie yesterday, and I was trying to get her to do this or to do that, oh my goodness, now I see, that difficulty, that resistance that she was having, this was most probably counterwill. And so why do we have these instincts? Why does this exist? Is there a purpose to this existence? And so, yes, absolutely. Counterwill is an instinct that is totally natural and intended. There is a purpose to this. Please understand that, and actually this happens to us as adults too, not just to children. I really wanted to make that nuance, because even us as adults, sometimes we're working, and our boss comes, and has this very kind of sharp type of comment, and then we react, although we're more mature and that we're able to kind of, temper ourselves, we still have within us this impulse to want to resist and oppose. And so just so we know that it's within all of us. But the one of the purposes of counterwill is to protect the child from strangers, to not follow anybody and anyone at any time. The idea is that the child will follow those that they are close to. And then, by saying this, you'll say, well, okay, Catherine, I understand that, children are supposed to not follow strangers and to follow, those that they're close to, but how come they're opposing, me, who's their teacher that I've been with all year, or how come they're opposing their mother or their father? And so the other piece that ties into counterwill instinct is this idea that we need to develop our sense of self, to grow into ourselves as a person. And so the sense of self, what we call this the individuation process, in order to allow to discover our own will, our own preferences, our own likes and dislikes, there needs to be this kind of natural bubble to protect ourselves from the outside influence in order to discover ourselves. And so that's there for that reason as well, to be able to allow for the child to figure themselves out as they're developing. And so it is quite healthy for a child to show counterwill tendencies. Some children will show them more strongly than others. It's true that, it's not equal throughout. Same thing with adults. Some adults are more, resistant than others. There's a question of sensitivity that could play into that. A child who may stay stuck in that instinct is because they're having a hard time facing vulnerable feelings or having trust for the adult, where they feel that they're not taken care of, or where they feel that they're trying to push them to do something that they don't want to do. And so the more the child is perceptive, the more the child is sensitive. It is true that the counterwill instinct may come out more in those situations. You may also notice that developmentally, there's phases where counterwill comes out more than others. So of course, the preschool phase is a huge one where there's a lot of counterwill. Adolescence too, there's a lot of counterwill that happens there too, but it doesn't disappear in between. It does still continue on, but at different degrees. And so I keep on using the word counterwill. I kind of wanted to deconstruct the word. And so we're countering the will of others. And so will, what do we mean by will? Will is basically our intentions, our initiatives, our wants and wishes, our preferences and priorities, judgments and opinions, values and goals, plans and decisions, meanings and motives. And so these are examples of what we mean by will. And so when a child is young and immature and still has not yet figured out what their wants and wishes are, and that the adult comes along and imposes their want and wishes onto them, they have a bigger instinctual reaction to counter the will of others. And so this is what is happening there. And so, as I mentioned before, counterwill happens in both instances of in the service of attachment, so the child doesn't attach to strangers, and in the service of what we call emergence. And so, emergence is basically the individuation process. It's the process where the person comes into themselves as a person and get a better sense of their own will. And so, in terms of the attachment piece, The picture here is meant to be a stranger who is, taking the child away. And of course, we want the child to have good survival instincts, that they won't let themselves leave with just any stranger. And so to be able to keep their want to please to adults that they know, and not to any random person. And this is where counterwill is a tricky instinct, I feel, for children, because of course, we want these children to grow up to be, have their voice, to be able to not be, influenced to get stepped on, and to be able to have some confidence. However, we want the same person as a child to be able to follow our lead, to to listen to what it is that we want them to do, and we need to understand that it's the same person, yes, growing up, but if we stomp on that instinct as they're young, then as they're growing up, it's the same person with the same instinct. And so how can we as adults try to make space for that as best as we can? Of course, I can understand in a classroom, with many needs and with, many students, and there's things to get done, it can get quite tricky. And so it can be somewhat of a difficult dance to manage. And I do understand that. One of the pieces too to think about is, the example here in this slide is about the substitute teacher. And so of course, even given now with the pandemic, and teachers are getting sick, and that there's replacement, it were to be expected that the student would react more to somebody that they don't know. And so if you do have a replacement, a substitute teacher, chances are those who have a hard time already taking the lead, following the lead of other adults, will have an even harder time with a substitute teacher. And so what practices can you use to build and to deepen your relationship with the student, to be able to help in terms of the attachment? Because we need to understand that even if the student feels close to us, that it's, now that we're in April, of course, the students build a rapport with us over the months of the school year. It doesn't mean that they're attached to us, that they're always engaged in our attachment. And so how can we keep in mind that if we have a task for them to do, how can we get them to be receptive to us, to be able to warm them up a little bit before we get them to work? And so keeping that in mind. And in terms of building the relationship, we can always continue to build and to deepen relationships. Of course, for students with multiple challenges, there are a lot. Eva spoke about this at length in her previous presentation about how many frustrations and alarming situations that they get through in their days. And so the more that they're kind of moved by their emotions, the harder it is for them to be able to be in a state where they're receptive to follow our lead. I wanted to stop here for a second to explain a little bit the attachment that plays into the counterwill instinct. Sorry. And so I'll use the analogy of the magnet, in understanding that attachment has two polarities. And when the child is in a place where they're feeling connected to us, yes, they have a good rapport with us, but they're also engaged to us in that moment, then there really is a pull between them to us where they want to please, they want to follow our lead, and so forth. And so that's why, oftentimes when we're presenting our material, Eva, myself, and Martine, we do put a lot of emphasis on the relationship, because when we do have that connection, the relationship helps to do the work for us, rather than us having to pedal really, really hard to make it work. The natural powers of the relationship it softens the child in order for them to want to please us and to follow our lead. However, there is the negative polarity of attachment. And if the child doesn't have that sense of closeness to us, or in the moment is not engaged in our relationship, then they may not have in them the pull or the instinct to want to please us or to follow our lead, especially if they don't know us very well. I mean, we had the example before of the substitute teacher. And so of course, for the substitute teacher who doesn't come around very often, it makes it much more difficult for that adult to be able to catch the wanting to please of that student. So one of the things that we would suggest in that situation is that if there is another adult in the building, in the classroom, that does know the child and does have a good rapport, how could they play matchmaker to be able to have the other adult come on the same side, and talking about village of attachment. And so of course we're talking at school, but also a brand new student who's just started the year, or a student that's very young that's never come to school, to be able to have the family to play a role into matchmaking, and understanding that it's not about roles. And so it's not because I'm the teacher or I'm the principal that by default the child should listen to me. Unfortunately, children don't work by role, they work by relationship. So you could actually be an expert in attachment and behavior, and to that child, you're a nobody. And so it's not about what you know, it's not about being an expert in that field, it's more about, does the child know you? Does the child feel comfortable with you, and is able to have that dance, that back and forth? And so, oh yeah, and so of course the adult then, if there is a good matchmaking that happens, of course then the adult will then fall into the positive polarity of the attachment. And so in terms of attachment in Counterwill, why does a child oppose an adult to whom he or she is attached? And so I mentioned this really quickly before. When the directive is given to the child who is attached to someone or to something else. And so if in that moment the child is distracted, and let's say they're talking to a peer in the classroom and they're engaged into that rapport with their friend, it makes it more difficult in that moment for them to listen to the adult who's giving them the cue, because their attachment, kind of like I don't know how you say this, Eva, like the horses where they have
The blinders
the blinders,
are
thank
on.
you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Exactly. And so they're only focusing right on the peer. And so it's difficult for them to open up the blinders, and in order to be more in that rapport with the adult. And so making sure in that moment and it doesn't need to be eye contact per se, but just in the body language, you can get a sense as to whether or not the child is engaged or is paying attention to us, and that we're there with them. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that, of course, now given pandemic, and this is a good example to illustrate this, when students are alarmed by situations that are very difficult, sometimes the counter will instinct will be left aside temporarily until the child passes through whatever difficult situations they're faced with. Whether it's an alarming situation, it's a frustrating situation, they kind of get distracted, if you will, from the counter will instinct at hand in the moment. However, it's not because the child is being really good at following, or let's say there's a fire drill and that they're really good to paying attention in that moment. It doesn't mean that the counter will has disappeared. It's just kind of left for later. And it's the same thing for emotions. Eva's spoken about that as well, how emotions can get displaced from, let's say the child's frustrated and then they get afraid of something, the frustration will get displaced and then will come back. It's the same thing with instincts. So counterwill can be displaced temporarily. And so another reflective type of question to look at, as I'm speaking about this topic, is what activities could you use to engage the student's attachment and their receptivity? And sometimes it doesn't take much. Sometimes it's just about connecting with them on something they really like, or that you notice something about them that you may have in common, you wearing a similar color or something of that sort. And that really helps to kind of get them engaged into the situation. Even calling their name very softly and showing a smile can be able to warm up that student, and then you can move on to the task at hand. And so I mentioned peers earlier, when a student is, talking to another student next to them and that they're distracted. Now that's a part of the situation, but some students in general tend to be more oriented towards their peers and have a harder time then to orient themselves towards the adult. And so how can we help to deepen and to warm up that relationship and engage those instincts even more, especially in the classroom when there's tasks to be done, to be able to get them to remove the orientation towards the peers back to on us. And that's a tricky thing to do. I think that some students have a harder time depending on their life situation, having gone through some tricky things where they have a hard time trusting adults, that it could be more difficult for them to orient themselves towards adults. They tend to orient themselves more towards peers. Although, of course, if a child has a physical disability and is bound to a wheelchair, for example, it prevents them from moving away from adult help, because of course physically they need that help, but it doesn't mean that on an instinctual level they don't get the resistance from it. And I could imagine, for a student who I'll just move forward, who has a hard time, with all of the frustration of being bound to the chair and needing to depend on others to help them. It adds on to all of the have-tos that they need to face, that if we're going to ask them to do something academically, it's yet one more have-to. And that, can be really, really difficult for them. And so, of course, I mentioned, calling their name really softly, or noticing something about them, or making, a joke, or laughing with them about something. This is what we call collecting. And so how, through our body language, with our smile, with our eyes, or with our comments, how can we get them to warm them up, so then we can move forward to the task at hand. Now, please keep in mind that a young child who is immature, there is a how can I explain this? Kind of like a proportion between the degree to which the adult will make a demand, or have an expectation, and the degree to which the child in that moment, depending on how receptive they are to our attachment, how much there is a desire to please. And so if the child has a desire to please, and that desire to please is greater than the adult's expectation, then there will not be as much resistance. However, if the adult's expectation seems to be much grander in the child's experience than their desire to please, then the opposite is true too. The less they have the desire to please, the less they have the impulse to comply, or the urge to make it work, the more counterwill there will be. And so this is kind of a cue for you, that when you feel some resistance from that student, and if you do have a good rapport, maybe to think about in that moment, are they receptive to our attachment? Are they wanting to please us, or to make it work? Rather than trying to put even more pressure, because if you put even more pressure, then the balance goes even more off keel, and then there will be even more resistance and opposition. And so I had put together an inventory, and again, this is just to get you reflecting on how many have-tos do our students have in a day at school. Whether it's, and now with pandemic, I've got pictures here on the right hand side about putting the masks, washing the hands, and so of course that's been a lot more of have-tos, having the distancing and all of that. How about in a learning situation? How many have-tos does the student that you work with has in their daily learning situation? How about in their life, whether it's at home? You've got here a picture in the middle of a parent who's brushing their child's teeth, who either cannot physically do it themselves, or that has an aversion to brushing their own teeth, and sometimes parents will then step in to help, but sometimes the stepping in then becomes more have-tos than want-tos. And so all of these things become accumulation in the student's daily life. And so of course, by the time they come to you in the classroom, how many of these have-tos they've had from the second they've woken up in the morning to getting through the morning routine, to taking the bus, to coming to school, and then sitting in class, and so forth. And so when you start thinking about the quantity of have-tos that happen in a day, you're like, oh my goodness, no wonder there's a lot of resistance and opposition. And so, I mentioned earlier that counterwill is there, yes, for the attachment, but also for the child to prepare their way to develop their sense of self. And so, as long as the child does not have a sense of self, and so the emergent self is very small, the child will then counter the adults ideas, agendas, intentions, judgments, expectation, demands, values, desires. And so the less they have a sense of themselves, the more they'll have resistance. As the child grows and has a better sense of their person and knows what are their desires, their intentions and whatnot, then the outside desire or expectation doesn't seem as big or doesn't put as much pressure, because this child is able to recognize in themselves that will. So it feels like less pressure. However, the opposite is true too, that if a student has a very small sense of self, and this could be due to young age, but it could also be due to a stuckness in development, where the child didn't have a chance to mature as fast as typical development. And so the more the child's immature, the less they have a sense of self and the more there is counterwill. And so similarly to the slide that I showed you earlier about the child's desire to please us and our expectation, it's true in the same way as well, that if the child doesn't have a very big sense for themselves of their own desires, purpose, or initiatives, then the adult's expectation, pressure, and demands seem so much bigger and put so much more pressure onto them. And so similarly to my question before, what are practices that you can use to make room for the student's will? How can we help them find their own initiatives, their own involvement, where we could ask them the question, what do they think about this or that, or how would they want it to be done? I mean, without it them taking the lead, of course, we're the adult and we're there to assist them and to stay in charge. But I think it is important to be able to hear them out, to let them have their voice and to be able to share some of their views or some of their thoughts. And the more that they feel heard and understood, the more it is helpful for them to, first of all, build their sense of self, but also for them to not feel as coerced by the adult who is there to accompany them. And so we know that, of course, a child who is stuck in counterwill is quite challenging to manage, and challenging for all adults, not just for school staff, for parents as well. They're much less receptive to being led in general. They're highly resistant to direction and guidance from the adults. They're much less endearing, unfortunately. They tend to alienate us in their response. And so we need to try to talk ourselves through this, that when we are feeling alienated by the student, how can we help ourselves kind of diffuse it, neutralize ourselves, and to see it as an instinct? They're not doing it on purpose to anger us, to push us away. They don't mean to do this. This is beyond their control. And so when we understand that they're struggling with this themselves, it gives more compassion and empathy for us to be able to come alongside it and to work with them, rather than taking it personal and then reacting to that. Of course, a student who is very resistant and oppositional tends to look like they're independent or not as needy. And the truth is, it's actually quite the opposite. I talked about immaturity before, and the fact that not being engaged in the attachment. And so it's a false perception, I should say. And so we need to be there to continue to support them, and to try to not trigger the counterwill. And that's the dance, right, between being there for them and leading them, and yet not triggering them as well. It is very difficult to bring them to a state of rest and to feel fulfilled. And consequences and sanctions are highly provocative for these types of students, as you can believe, because if they already have counterwill to our directives, imagine to consequences, where there's even more pressure that's added on at that point. So oftentimes part of the drama, unfortunately, with the student who is in counterwill instinct in that moment, is that when the child is stuck in that mode, the initial kind of default or reaction, the natural kind of reaction of the adult, is to put more pressure, is to start pushing, thinking that if we, change our tone, if we have a certain look, or that if we show to the student that we're serious, that perhaps they'll kind of backtrack, and that they'll be able to take our lead. However, for some students, this is very highly provocative, and it will actually make them stuck even more. And so if the student then feels pushed, they will put on the brakes. It is true that some students, if they're alarmed enough, that they will then follow our lead or take our directive. But those students who are not being moved by their alarm will then put more of the brakes. And the tragedy then is that when the kids get stuck in their resistance, then the adults then get stuck at times in their persistence. And so if we can catch ourselves in this cycle and notice that as we're putting pressure, there's more and more brakes that are coming on, how can we take a step back from that and to try to backtrack and to try from another angle, to be able to soften, to be able to diffuse the student? And so, of course, the more that the student is frustrated, if there's a lot of have-tos that are happening in their day, as I mentioned earlier, that may mean that the frustration will make that it will add on potentially more counterwill, and so forth. And so that plays into it. I was talking earlier about the three acts, and so this is another way to look at it. When the child is feeling coercion or separation, they may put themselves more in opposition and resistance. And then the adult may try to take the alpha lead to go in to be in charge and to perhaps give more directives or to have some sort of discipline or consequence. And then this becomes a vicious circle because this adds on more separation and more coercion for the student, and then so forth. And this goes into circles. And so, of course, what we want to know once we've understood the dynamic and the instinct is, okay, so what do we do with this now? How do we approach this? How do we handle that? And so, as I mentioned a few times, counterwill is not an emotional, it's not a learned response. It's not something that the student chooses to do. It's an emotional reaction, an instinctual reaction that plays a critical role in preserving the self and in becoming a separate person. The belief that resistance and opposition must be unlearned doesn't recognize or value the developmental benefits of having one's own mind and fails to appreciate that we need to grow a child out of resistance, not punish them or teach them to behave otherwise. This was a quote from Deborah McNamara from her book, Rest, Play, Grow. And so the idea here is that if we understand it's developmental and that it's an instinct, then it's not about learning it or unlearning it. And it's not about making it go away, it's trying to find a way to work with it. And so, of course, counterwill plays into learning. We need, understanding that what makes a student feel vulnerable can evoke counterwill. And so for a student who has a hard time learning, that doesn't know what to expect, that feels inadequate, especially in front of peers, that the learning situation at tasks, at hand, confirms that the inadequacy that they're feeling, facing that loss of attachment because either there's a disappointment in the faces of those around them, that can add on to the counterwill. And so let's, as adults, I alluded to this a little bit, but I'll, being more explicit here, trying to not let a counterwill break the connection, being careful to not take counterwill personally, to anticipate and expect that counterwill will be there. I can guarantee you, with the students that you work with, given every single multiple challenges that they are faced on a daily basis, these kids are full of counterwill. And those that are not, oh my goodness, or that have little of it, oh my goodness. It is to be expected that many of these students will have, given, what they face on a daily basis. Reflect the resistance as natural and normal. Repair the damage that's done by the counterwill fallout. And what I mean by that is when you catch yourself in more pressure, and that the student is in more resistance, that at that point we can backtrack and try to find a way around that. Being careful not to use separation as a consequence, like, for example, timeouts or giving them ultimatums or things like that, to not make the behavior the bottom line. Of course, they're struggling, and they're there for a reason. Yes, the disability is part of the reason why they're there, but also because they're struggling in whether it's learning or being in a classroom, and to be able to repair. Oh, I just noticed I used it twice. Okay, sorry about that. I guess it was an important point, so I'm saying it twice. Um, when faced with a challenge of the wills, and what I mean by that is, of course, we have our own instincts, right? As adults, and us too, we have our counterwill instinct. And when the student starts becoming resistant and perhaps even bossy and does not want to follow our lead and is trying to make, to do it their way, it does trigger us. It does trigger in us our instinct to not let the student take over, to not the student to push onto us what it is that they want. And so to be careful not to find yourself in a power struggle, to recognize this own instinct in yourself as well, to not let yourself be alienated by the behavior, to detach your own anger from your discipline, to separate the response from the incident and to choose a more suitable time. And so of course, like if you see that picture with the student with his hands there on his waist, it is very difficult in that moment when the student has dug their heels to get them out of in that moment, to get them out of that power struggle. And so how can we, sometimes by like asking them, like giving them a directive and then walking away to go and check on another student and then coming back, just the fact that you've stepped away physically and that you're not like in their face and like you're staring at them and you've got your hands on your waist, it helps for them to remove some of that nonverbal pressure. And sometimes students are more capable to put their instinct aside and then get to the task at hand by naming it, dropping it, let it go, and then kind of stepping away from the situation. And sometimes just kind of even naming to the student, I understand you don't feel like doing this right now. Normalizing, validating the fact that they have, this instinct that is pushing them, that too can help to diffuse. To try to change the circumstance affecting the child rather than trying to control their behavior. So for example, if you're in the classroom and you're working on a task at hand and there's just no way around it, the student is balking left, right, and center, sometimes going for a walk, leaving the task at hand for a minute there on the desk, and then stepping out of the classroom, going for a walk, or if the student, of course, can't walk, that they're on a wheelchair to for them to be pushed around, and just to change the environment. Sometimes that helps to diffuse the situation. So more guidelines to consider. Give the impression that you can and that you will take care of the student by projecting your own confidence and your calmness, that you can do this, that you'll make it work. Does it mean that it's easy? No, not at all. Does it mean that it's simple? Not often. And so the idea here is not to convince ourselves. It's sometimes it's more about faking it until we can make it. We're giving the impression to the student that we've got this, that we're there for them, that we get it. Even though inside we're pedaling. Relying on structures, routines, and rituals. This is a huge, huge thing. And I know that you guys are terrific at doing that type of thing, with visual schedules, and showing students sequences and what's coming up next. It really helps to be able to, the more that you rely on routine, structure, and ritual, the less it becomes about you said so in that moment to the student. It becomes about the routine. It becomes about the ritual. And you can almost come alongside the student. Like, for example, the student has to wash their hands, and then they don't want to, and it's not Catherine said you have to wash your hands. It's, oh my goodness, this is what is on the the expectations. And so I understand you don't feel like washing your hands. Us too, sometimes the adults, we're fed up of washing our hands. We've washed our hands so much in the last months. And so to be able to normalize and validate that, and then you become an ally. It's not that you become against them and you're forcing them to wash their hands. You get it. But at the same time, you say, but I'm sorry, this is what needs to be done. And it's done in a way, that we get them. And sometimes that helps to diffuse the situation. Being careful to not reveal your own sense of helplessness. Sometimes adult, without meaning to, will say things like, in despair, will say things like, well, I don't know, I know, like, I'm done, or I don't know, what to do with you, or what to say at this point. And really being careful to not alarm them with our own kind of sense of helplessness, and being careful to not reveal our own needs or felt inadequacies or fears. When we feel like the student is balking with us, this is where, when you're feeling up to here, you've got a team for this. Talk to your colleagues, talk to whomever is there that knows the child too, that gets it as well, because they're faced with it as well. And to be able to work these things, to be able to vent with them, but being careful to not do that with the student at present. Other guidelines to consider, providing a sense of choice. I mentioned that really briefly earlier, without, of course, giving them too many options, but it could be that, let's say they don't want to do a certain task at hand. Rather than saying do it, it could be, well, how about, you want to choose question number 1 or number 3? Which one would you like to start with? And so sometimes for them to feel that they have a sense of choice, that even though they don't feel like doing the activity at hand, just the fact that they get to decide how many questions or which of the questions they get to do, that can help to diffuse a situation, to normalize, as I mentioned just before, that there are times that we don't feel like doing certain things and being pushed around, and it does call in us this instinct to resist and to oppose. To focus on the child's intention and efforts. Of course, Counterwill will get in the way most times, but we know that underneath, the child does, especially when we've got that good relationship and there's been good days where they do, their best, to be able to remind them that we've seen that in them, that we know that, when they're in a good place, when they're not too frustrated, that they're capable, or that they're willing to follow our lead, and to be able to highlight that the positive part of when they are in that positive polarity of the attachment. I mentioned before, making room for their initiative and their involvement. It could even be, if they've done something that they regret, that they may take part in in terms of the repair. So let's say that, they've said something, or that they've done something, that they get a say in part of that conversation. One of the biggest important piece, and I can't highlight this enough, is what we call bridging. What we mean by bridging is that if there's been a difficult moment, a difficult day, that we say something to the student to the effect that I'm still your teacher, I'm still your préposé, you're still, tomorrow's another day, we'll try this again. And so the point of bridging is for the student to understand that, yeah, it's been hard, it's been a tough moment, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm still there for you, that I still want to work with you, and that tomorrow is just yet another day. And to help them to feel that, oh, okay, so this doesn't mean that my teacher no longer cares for me, or thinks that, I'm terrible, and that, this is it, I'm no longer going to do things with you. It really helps, because that's what often happens when they're insecure, especially. They quickly go to, oh my goodness, is this going to be the last straw that broke the camel's back, and that will mean that, they'll give up on me, the adults will give up on me. And so how to be able to convey the message that, yes, it was difficult, but no, I'm not giving up on you, tomorrow's another day. And so in terms of the handling, thinking about what we call the 3-prong. And so attachment is prong number 1. Coercion, working around coercion, is at prong number 2, and working around emergence is prong number 3. So how can we, with our body language and with our verbal, find ways to engage the attachment and to look attachable to the student? How can we, in their being able to develop their sense of self, that we could give them moments where they can have some sense of choice? And how can we, in times where they're feeling coerced, being able to minimize some of the felt coercion? So, for example, trying to speak in a less kind of bossy type of tone could be an example. And so to back off until you get a better attachment hold, if that's possible, or to have another adult step in. Sometimes, having a different adult there that also has a rapport with the child can help diffuse a situation. To lead the child through the power struggle, without giving up, and knowing that in that moment it's not the time to address it, to wait until we get past that, and to draw attention away from the coercive elements that are at hand. And so if the child's having a hard time with an activity at hand, or some sort of directive, to be able to either focus on maybe a playful way of doing it, where that can take away the attention from the coercion, or that we give them a sense of choice, and that could take away from the sense of them feeling pressured, and to be able to diffuse a little bit. So in terms of the reducing the coercion, I had these 2 pictures to illustrate a little bit that, our body language speaks loudly. And so sometimes we don't even realize that we're really frustrated, or we're tense, or we're having a hard day. And this is what the student sees from us in our body language. And so it makes it difficult for them to want to follow or lead, even though we may be very polite or we may be very patient. Sometimes just body language can work against us. And so refraining from using a commanding or a prescriptive manner, making the agenda less explicit. Like sometimes we give too much information to students, like we want them to do certain things and we give them too many details. If you've got an immature student that balks very often, you need to be more subtle with your agenda. And so trying, like for example, if you want them to wash their hands, you may sing a song about washing hands rather than telling him he has to wash his hands. And so it makes it less explicit. Refraining using language like should do, must do, has to do, and trying to use as little force as leverage as possible. I mentioned this earlier, so I'm repeating myself a little bit, which is good because I've got a visual here with the schedule. I'm using structure and routine to orchestrate the behavior, to guide the behavior, to teach routine in a fun way where there's fun pictures and there could be, even dances or music that can go with that, and really making the routine engaging. And so in terms of the attachment piece, I talked about collecting before, just, trying to find a way to connect with the student, whether it's by recognizing something you have in common, or talking about an interest that they have that they really like, and that's a way to be able to warm them up, and to be able to be there when they need you, and to really allow them to be oriented by you. And so especially for those students who tend to orient themselves towards their peers, how can we be that place, that go-to place, rather than their peers? Talking about how hard it is to have to always do things that we have to do, normalizing that at times we all want to refuse things that we must do, to allow the child some time and some space. And I mentioned that earlier, that you name it, you drop it, you step away, go check another student, come back. This could be a way for them to feel less pressure. And then in terms of the choices, provide some sense of choice, to put the focus on the child's will, of course, to a small degree. It's not that we're letting them decide everything, but for example, if they're going to have a snack, maybe they want to choose which snack they'll have first. Make room for their initiatives and their involvement. This example here with the picture, there's a little girl who has the task to share paper with different students. So giving them tasks and responsibilities sometimes give them a sense of taking something in charge and feeling like they've got a sense of choice in something. Play is a huge piece in order to diffuse counterwill. Being able to be playful in our tone, playful in our demeanor, playful with our directives. We could even use stories, or could be make-believe situations where we could guide them through and get them to what it is that we want them to do. It could be either through singing in different actions where it takes the mind off of having to do. Playing usually evokes smiles. And so when there's smiles there's increasing an attachment, and there's a willingness to please. To even get them to play with the no. Those students that find themselves to say no very often, I would see this with preschoolers, but I could see this very easily with, any school age student, where we get them to let out the no as much as they can and need to in the play mode. And sometimes getting all of that out helps them to be less resistant and oppositional, because they had some space to be able to let it out first. And so this is a slide that Eva brought up in her presentation on emotions. I wanted to bring it back here because I thought it was really a great way for us adults to start reflecting on when a student is resisting or opposing us, that we get a sense of what's the context at hand, or is there a pattern? When is this happening that the student is resisting us or opposing us? Where is this happening? With whom? Do we notice that there's precursors that could be contributing to the fact that they're resisting, or are there warning signs or triggers? And the other piece too, in terms of their life factors, in terms of their attachment, their maturity level, how many have-tos that they have, in their daily lives, all of this plays into how much or how little counterwill they will have. And so in terms of our role as adults, to kind of conclude, you know, the three key pieces is how can we have a better sense of what counterwill is, so adjusting our view, taking it less personally, understand that it is an instinct, and to try for us not to do harm with our own instinct. In terms of our stance, that we're not there to put pressure, but to normalize, to let the students have some space where they can take charge where possible, and for us to be patient, and to make room for their own will, and to indulge them in the play mode. And so, of course, on our website, we do have some sections that we address counterwill. We have, of course, today we're doing a presentation specifically to students with multiple challenges. We do have another presentation for any student. And so I invite you to go and check out our website. There's so many resources out there. One of the resources that I strongly recommend to take a look, Eva, Martin, and myself created a placemat where we address resistance and opposition and what can be done in the classroom, on the playground, and for students that tend to be more stuck in that. And my last slide is in terms of follow-up PD. So on April 27th, Sarah and Claudia will be joining Eva and myself. We will have a Q&A panel to be able to talk about any of the presentations and or anything else related to this clientele. I'll be more than happy to answer questions and comments from 4 to 5 on April 27th. On May 5th, we've got a presentation on the neuroscience of play, and on our last presentation of the year on May 26th, we've got helping the highly sensitive child. So we'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a lot of
much.
material to cover
I
in a
know,
short
in
amount
an
of
hour.
time. Yeah, no, that's great. There aren't any questions or comments right now. I did post the link to the evaluation form. So for those of you that
Wonderful.
yeah, before you go, if you don't mind just taking a moment, or it is also on our website as well. But we're open to questions, comments. Yeah, just anything that you want to know. Counterwill is one of the most challenging instincts, and yeah, one of the things that I often say, because it actually comes into conflict with our alpha instincts, and alpha instincts, we intuitively know that if a child won't listen to us, we can't teach them or lead them.
Right.
And so I kind of think of it as the counterwill versus alpha. And the trouble is that counterwill will always trump even alpha. But I often think if we could find a way to stay in charge, even if we can't be in control. And when I've talked to teachers about that, they've said, yes, because we have to be the ones in charge. Absolutely. But you can't control it, even to the point where you can say to the student, you know what, I've decided that right now, you actually don't need to do this. And so, yes, the child's getting away or doing what they want to do, but we've actually stayed in charge. And it's more for the other children. And ironically, as you say, Catherine, sometimes when we step back, and we say, fine, I've decided that you don't want to do it, I have actually seen students looking to see that you're gone and sneaking it out and doing it. I mean, it's quite an amazing instinct. So yeah, sometimes you have to go through the back door.
Mm-hmm. There was a question here. Some students do not like it when some do not have to do a task. How do you handle this?
Oh, well, yes, of course, the other students say, well, how come I have to do it if he doesn't have to? This is, again, you have to be the alpha. You have to say, I decide what's best for you, and I decide what's best for the other students. And again, if that student starts getting more and more into their counterwill, you can say, well, you know what, I've decided you don't have to do it either. If the entire class is refusing to do something, then maybe we all need to, and again, I've watched teachers play these instincts so brilliantly. I've watched a teacher see a group of students, they're not cooperating, she's trying to get them to cooperate, and they're not, and all of a sudden the teacher goes, students, I have decided we're going to leave this for today. We'll come back to it tomorrow. And of course, that gives you a chance to relook at the assignment. Maybe there's something about it. You can make it easier. As long as you stay in charge of it, that's what the most important thing is, because kids want to know who's in charge. So you're right in being upset by counterwill, but you have to find a way to work with it. As Catherine said, it's part of who we are as human beings.
I had a question about the placemat. I'm just going to get the link and I'll share it in the chat. So you'll be able to access the placemat directly. All right, so I just copy and I'll paste. Oh, and I need to put for everyone.
Yes, I ended up sending a message to the panelists.
There we go. And so, so this is the link to the page on our member site on resistance and opposition. There's other resources in there, but the placemat is there and it's available both in English and in French. Wonderful. I always appreciate talking about this topic because it's a reality that we all have, are often faced with. And so, making sense of it and understanding how to dance with that is just so key.
Yeah. Somebody said a great, any idea on what to do if a student will not do anything and he throws things? Well, to me, that would indicate, first of all, we have a student who's very, very frustrated. And again, we have to think about it. We didn't have time today because we're a very, very short period of time, but I often did this with frustration, but we would do it, as you said, Catherine, with the have-tos. Just list, give yourself 30 seconds, put your timer on for 30 seconds and just start listing all the things that these kids have to do. And that they have no control over. Like if somebody has to put their shoes on, they have to do this, they have to do that. They get to school sometimes just don't like to have to do so much. And so it's tough because we also have an agenda for them. But their agenda book is overloaded. Some of it is just giving a few choices. I know that there are some teaching techniques where they have a basket where they can choose whatever they want to do within that basket, or 3 different baskets. Just whatever you can to allow that initiative to come out, a little bit of initiative. But for some children, they are exhausted. They are exhausted.
Well, and then that's what I was thinking, Eva. Sometimes, when there's a resistance from a student to do work, it's not necessarily always counterwill. Like sometimes it could be that the student is really tired or they're overstimulated, and so there's an overload there on a sensory level. And sometimes, understanding that we need to fulfill their needs first before we get them to do what it is that they need to do, and so going, getting out of the classroom for a break. And depending on the mobility of the student, of course, getting them to be able to move a little bit, or that they need some downtime. Somebody said offering a snack. Totally, food is another one too. Like sometimes being low on energy, and so. And so those things, to try to see if there's something else at play there that could be impacting why is it the student is resisting, and it's not necessarily just because they're countering our will. It could just be that they're just either exhausted, overwhelmed. Yeah. Who knows what's happening at home? Maybe even.
Counterwill is an instinct that serves, right? It's a basic instinct that basically says, I'm overwhelmed. It's too much for me. Leave me alone right now because I'm tired. I mean, it's a very raw instinct, but yes, it serves many purposes.
Yeah.
And I know we have big worries. We have IEPs for these students. We want to show that they're moving ahead. We want to show that we are engaging with them. But sometimes less is more. Sometimes less is more. Sometimes we have 6 things we want them to do that day, but we just have to back right off. We did this with children with behavior disorders who often refuse to do work. And for a whole month, they just did activities until one little boy finally came up to the teacher and says, when are we actually going to work? This is a kid who had thrown his work around, but I know that's hard to trust, that if we back off, we'll actually get as much done. But my goodness, if they're really disrupting and throwing, kicking and hitting, we are overwhelming them. That is for sure. Yeah.
It's more of a comment than a question. I think it's the idea that like there's so many adaptations that we're doing nowadays to support students because we're more aware, right? We're more aware of trauma, more aware of sensory issues, so we are more sensitive to that and tend to cater better to our students. But it's true that back in the day, what would happen to these students with counterwill? Oh my goodness, I mean,
well, they would be punished, they would be hurt, they would be put into corners, they would be duct taped. We were not very nice to children like that. And then sadly, sometimes we also broke their will. And the saddest child to me, and I'll just end on this because we're at the end of our time, but one of the saddest cases I saw was a little girl who was tremendously abused. And she spent her whole the months that she was with us in kindergarten, never saying no, always doing everything that the teacher wanted her to do. She was very, very withdrawn. And I knew that basically her, in effect, her will had been broken. And the kindergarten teacher did a marvelous job with her, just a marvelous job. And I knew she did a marvelous job because the kindergarten teacher was given the option of having the little girl repeat with her. And she said, well, yes, I do want her to come back. I know it's important for her to have a good relationship with me, but Eva, she's starting to say no. And I thought to myself, wow, she's finding her will again. In that particular case, because of a whole bunch of other factors as well, we realized that probably she needed to be in a program for children with behavior problems, because we wanted her to say no way more often than she would have been allowed to say no in a regular classroom. And so when we brought her into the NEST program, our IEP goal for her was she will say no many times in a day.
Wow.
Well, because
It's counterintuitive, right?
it's counterintuitive, but
Yeah.
she was so unable to speak up for herself.
Mm.
So yeah, this is something that we work with, is how do we let them speak up for themselves while getting the task done. So this is a challenge you all of you face, and thank you so much for your questions
Thank
and
you.
comments, and do come back and join us in April. You can just sign up and bring any questions that you have to the table, and there will be a panel of us and we'll be happy to answer them for you. So
Thank
thank you
you.
very much, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Mm-hmm.